All right, so thanks everyone. I'm hoping that this will be the first of many talks that we've been missing out on now for the last year and a half or so. I know a lot of other societies across the country are using Zoom. Zoom seems to be the way to go these days. And so I'm delighted to see that we're finally going down that road now. I think it's going to make a huge difference, especially as Karen mentioned, getting out in the winter months up to the garden can sometimes be a bit dicey. This way, it's probably advantageous in some respects to just do this by Zoom. And then hopefully, well, you never know, maybe by April or May, we'll be able to meet in person, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Okay, so my presentation this evening is all about my trip to Georgia. Georgia on my mind, but it's the country, not the state. And it was actually the last trip I took before the pandemic kicked in. That was in 2019, literally only probably 6 months or 7 months before the pandemic hit us. So I didn't realize, of course, at the time just how fortunate we were to be able to travel, because now I'm really got that travel bug and just can't do anything about it. So Georgia itself, here we go. So there's a map of the world. You'll see my my little icon here. So we're talking about Georgia is right here, this little tiny green country between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And it's considered as being sort of on the cusp between Asia and Europe. I think most books will say it's really the western end of Asia. Some authorities will say it's the very eastern part of Europe, okay? But either way, it's on the cusp there. Now, it was an independent country. Back in 1921, it was taken over by Russia, back during that expansion era of Russia. And basically it was under Russian rule for 70 years. And then they gained back independence in 1991, back when a lot of Russian held countries were basically going back to their original roots. So, so at this stage in the game, they are their own independent country. So here's a slightly larger view. Tbilisi is the capital, and that's where you had to fly into. We actually had to fly, I had to fly from here to London, London to Istanbul, and then Istanbul to Tbilisi. So it took a while. I think it was at least one overnight flight before I finally arrived in Tbilisi. And so here's a larger view of the country. So now what we're talking about here in Georgia, really the whole purpose of this is with a company called Green Tours, which do botanical tours all over the world. And this particular one was to visit and see the flowers of the Caucasus Mountains. And the Caucasus Mountains, if you look on where you follow my mouse, the Caucasus Mountains basically form the northern boundary of Georgia. That's the Greater Caucasus. And then the southern boundary of Georgia is the Lesser Caucasus. In between these two mountain ranges is basically areas of plain, a lot of growing in those areas, a lot of agricultural areas. But overall, Georgia is a fairly mountainous area. So when our tour flew in, we arrived in Tbilisi, and then we sort of went to, I guess you call it, to the east of that, and we went to the area called Rustavi, okay, which is sort of on the eastern edge right here, close to the border with Azerbaijan. And then from there, we went north and we came up to the area around Kazbek, which is right on the border with Russia, the Kazbegi National Park. And then we went from there across the plains down to the Lesser Caucasus to the area around Bakuriani. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the Rustavi area, which is sort of almost, the terrain is something like Alberta, to tell you the truth. It's sort of rolling prairies with lots of dry, essentially semi-desert type environment. And then we'll go to the Greater Caucasus, and then we'll go to the Lesser Caucasus. Okay, so here's the Rustavi and Azerbaijan border. So, I mean, anyone who's ever been up around the Badlands of Alberta, you look at this and you think that's probably where this picture was taken. I was quite shocked when I saw it, because it really was a deja vu to southern Alberta. And I've spent so much time in southern Alberta because my brother lives up that way. But anyway, so this area is all sort of rolling hills, lots of grasslands, lots of dry ravines, dry plateaus. And now I'm on a little sort of range looking into Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan looks very bleak, very empty. And I think really outside of the coastal areas, it is fairly bleak for that matter. Now it's a little bit of political unrest, we'll say, in Azerbaijan between them and Georgia. And when we were standing in this particular area, there were actually a number of military people, and we weren't allowed to take pictures in certain directions. Otherwise, they will confiscate our cameras. So I thought it was quite hysterical, to tell you the truth. But other than that, I found Georgia to be very safe. I found the people there to be very, very nice and very friendly. And I really enjoyed that particular trip. The reason we went to Rustavi was to actually see an old, basically a church, a monastery that was built literally into the side of the hill. Okay, so these would have been all carved out by the Russian Orthodox, because that's the main religion over in this part of the world. So it was quite amazing to wander around inside these ruins to see what was there. So we did a little bit of that, and then we did some botanizing around the area. So what I noticed first off was that a lot of our common garden plants that we grow here are actually native to Georgia. The Caucasus Mountains is a very important botanical area for a lot of our hardy ornamental plants that we grow in our gardens, both sort of standard ornamentals as well as a lot of the rock garden plants we grow, and a number of the common bulbs that we grow in our garden. So this is the gas plant, Dictamnus albus, and the flowers can be white or they can be different shades of pink, sort of this pale pink being the most common color. The plant exudes a very lemony fragrance. And so this is a plant that presumably on a calm evening, you can actually light a match to it and the volatile oils will catch fire just in a very quick burst. Who knows, it might have been the burning bush that Moses saw back in the day, because that plant is native to that part of the world. This is a plant that's in the Boraginaceae, and it's called Onosma caucasica. And you're going to see that a number of the plants have the species name caucasica, which simply means from the Caucasus. Okay, so Onosma, it's not a plant that we can grow very well around here. It does like a much drier climates, drier winters in particular than what we have. Achillea, good old yarrow. Their yarrow over there wasn't white. It was Achillea micrantha, which has got yellow flowers. So essentially fulfills the same role, growing in disturbed areas along roadsides and whatnot, but it just has yellow flowers as opposed to white. Scutellaria orientalis, lovely rock garden plant. I've grown it a couple of times. It's not long lived in our climate, but presumably over there it lives much longer because the plants were a heck of a lot larger than what I ever grew. So it's a type of skullcap. And there's a closer view of the flowers there. So we have a couple of skullcaps here in Newfoundland, but they have blue flowers. And then this is Javari, which is one of the larger communities. You can see the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox Church there on the left-hand side. Surprisingly enough, the larger cities seem to be fairly prosperous, but a lot of the the little small villages seemed rather poor. So there seemed to be a big juxtaposition between those who were affluent versus those that didn't have the money. So it was sort of sad to see that. But certainly in the larger centers, everything seemed very clean, very tidy. In the countryside, however, the homes might have looked much poorer, but they were still very clean. So the people were very proud about what they had, even if they didn't have a lot. There's another monastery. So we visited a lot of monasteries when we were in this area. So it seemed like it was, mornings going to the monastery, and then the afternoons botanizing, or vice versa, depending on how hot it was going to get during the day. So in this area, it was fairly warm. So we did most of the monasteries in the afternoon, did our botanizing in the morning. But then as we got into the mountains, we did it sort of the other way around. So this is just sort of the fields around this particular area in eastern part of Georgia. And what you're seeing here are all hawthorns, okay, the different species of hawthorn, Crataegus, that were blooming at the time of the year when I was there. And I was there during the month of May, okay, so it was early May. Their springs come a heck of a lot earlier than what they do around here. They're probably a good month or so ahead of us. This particular part of the country was really about the only place where we saw any number of orchids, because most of the time we're up in the mountains, and in the mountains there was still lots of snow around, so it was pretty early in the season for orchids for them. But in this particular, in the eastern part, spring came early, and as a result, some of the orchids were starting to bloom. So this one right here is called Anacampsis morio. Very, very common orchid throughout all of Europe, really. It's probably one of the most common orchids that grow there. There's some variations. Some are deep purple, some are very pale purple, and some are even white. Another Anacamptis, Coriophora, which is sort of got this unusual sort of a dusty rose type color with a bit of green. It's rather easy to overlook this particular orchid, even when it's in flower. It's not a particularly brilliant colored flower. They only have one species of Platanthera. So unlike ourselves, where we seem to have more Platanthera than anything else, they only have the one species, which is Chlorantha, which is a green one. So it sort of looks in flower something like our orbiculata or macrophylla, sort of that. And you know, it just has two large leaves at the base. So obviously it's probably a European counterpart to our orbiculata or macrophylla. A lot of orchis species. This is what they call the burnt tip orchid, Orchis ustulata. So it looks something like our Amur orchis, which is now Galeris, I guess, in the latest nomenclature. Orchis purpurea subspecies caucasica. They call this the lady orchid. Very large. This particular plant grows probably about 2 feet tall. So it's one of the larger orchids over there. A lot of variation in the color of the flower. Some can be almost pure white and others can be very deep purple. This is Orchis simia, called the monkey orchid. And then these are hybrids between Orchis simia and Orchis purpurea. Okay, so there's a lot of variation when you get these hybrids, and you can get hybrid swarms in places where it's really hard to tell which species you're really looking at, because most of them are probably hybrids because they're back crossing back and forth. So you see some that look a lot like purpurea and others that look more similar to the simia. This is called Limidorum abortivum, and it's actually a saprophytic, or what the proper term is these days. Put it this way, it doesn't have chlorophyll. So something like our Coralla rhizus, okay, the coral roots, they live underground for a number of years, and then when you get enough energy built up, they'll produce a flower stem. So the flowers are very pale, sort of a lavendery, lilac-y color with a little bit of brown tinting, quite unusual. And the stems are almost black. So it's quite a striking orchid. You can see a closer view there. So it's quite a pretty little thing. I've seen them before in Greece, but I never saw them in bloom when I was there. So I was really happy to find a plant in Georgia that was at the peak of perfection. Really weird plant, Stevinelia satyrioides. You know, it's one of these little greeny things. It reminds me a lot of our, what used to be Coeloglossum, the frog orchid, which is now a Dactyloryza. So for all intents and purposes, this does look an awful lot like our native frog orchid. Okay, so we're going to leave now to east, and we're going to head up into the mountains. The Greater Caucasus are the taller of the two mountain ranges. And Greater Caucasus really are sort of getting elevations very similar to the Canadian Rockies. So there are actually glaciers in this area that, you know, where the snow stay year round. So you can see the highway there going through the mountain passes, and there's all sorts of wildflowers, beautiful things just growing right along the side of the road there. But at one point we did cross the highest pass in the Caucasus, and I will show you that, but it was quite spectacular once you got up to those kind of elevations. And we had spectacular weather, I have to say. I think there was only one day that we had a couple of showers in the morning, and that was it. Most of the other days were all just clear blue skies. So, you know, it's sort of like the prairies in that regards, prairies in the summer, just sun day after day after day. So right now, those mountains you see there in the background in the latest picture, that's actually looking into Russia. So you can see we start to get up into some of the fairly high elevations on some of these hillsides, and actually we're looking down into the valleys, and the valleys still have snow. And so this here is actually on the highest pass that we went over. You can see there was some green meadows just starting to form there, but where I'm standing to is quite a deep drift of snow. And you can still see, of course, plenty of snow still in the mountains at that point. And what's interesting is when you get an opportunity to get out and walk around the edges of these snowbanks, you think, there'd be nothing flowering there for ages. But it was a bit of an eye-opener. It was a bit of an eye-opener. Okay, so this is one of the higher mountains. There are actually people that will hike to the top of this one. So it's sort of their equivalent to Mount Everest, I guess. It's a very popular one with mountaineers, and they will scale this one right to the very top. So edges of the melting snow. I mean, you look at that, you say, there's not gonna be nothing there. It's, it's looking pretty brown, not a lot of greenery taking place there. And if there is anything growing there, it's probably not gonna bloom for several more weeks yet. Well, surprisingly, here, right on these melting snow edges were snowdrops. And I suppose we see that in our own gardens here. You'll see the snowdrops poking up through the snow, literally at the, in the end of March, early April. The same thing here. So as the snow retreats, the snowdrops essentially come immediately into flower. Now, what you're seeing at, of course, this time of the year, it's long days. Their days are they're not quite as far north as we are, but they still have pretty long days come May month. And the air temperature during the middle of the afternoon could be up to 15 degrees. Now, it will drop down to freezing at night, but it's quite warm during the daytime when you're up there. So it doesn't take very long for these snowdrops to respond to those kind of temperatures. And what was amazing was the numbers of these snowdrops. There were literally thousands and thousands and thousands just poking their noses right up through the snow. Now, these particular snowdrops have bigger leaves than the ones we grow. It's a different species called Galanthus platyphilus. And apparently in England, one bulb of this can fetch 6 or 7 pounds, right? So you got to double that for Canadians. They're like about $10 a bulb. So I was sort of walking through tens of thousands of dollars worth of bulbs if I could dig them up and sell them. It's absolutely amazing. So the flowers are actually a little bit larger than our snowdrops as well. Which is a closer view. And also what was blooming right on the edges of the snow was this ranunculus kochii. It looks something like a buttercup. It's actually very similar to our lesser celandine, that little weedy, little buttercuppy thing that you see in Barring Park. The flowers quite early in the season. This one, on the other hand, is not particularly weedy at all. And Anemone caucasica. So very similar to the Anemone blanda that we grow in our gardens. Anemone caucasica will either have white flowers or blue flowers, whereas the blandas have white, blue, or pink. And again, they literally bloom within a day or two of the snow melt. Now, along some of the alpine ridges, one of the few plants that I saw that was reminiscent of home, I guess, growing sort of slightly different habitat than what we're used to, are the marsh marigolds. And it's interesting that all my travels that I've done in the Northern Hemisphere, every place I've gone, I've seen marsh marigolds. So it's just one of these plants, very ubiquitous throughout the whole of the Northern Hemisphere, and always, of course, typically in wet areas. But in this case, the calthas were growing on these snowmelt edges, okay, high up in the mountains, whereas we're more used to seeing them growing, at lower elevations, on the edges of forests or whatnot. And then on the right-hand side there, what those little purple you see there are little primulas. Okay, different types of little primroses. So this is Primula algida. Bit larger, probably about twice the size of our Laurentianas. Otherwise, they do look very similar. Pushkinia psiloides. This is the Pushkinia we grow in our gardens. Okay, so it was really neat to see plants that I have in my garden that we're growing at the botanical garden, but seeing how they actually grow in the wild. And in my own garden, they naturalize in the lawn, and essentially that's where they're growing to in the wild. They're just basically growing on these alpine meadows. There's another little bulb called Gadgia sulfurea. It has these little, almost like a Star of Bethlehem, but the flowers are yellow as opposed to white. Fritillarias, Fritillaria latifolia. And it was amazing. These plants weren't particularly tall. They were probably only about maybe 6 inches high, but the flowers themselves were huge in comparison to the size of the plant itself. And it's beautiful, dark, maroony purple bells. Muscari. Now, this particular Muscari grape hyacinth is Muscari pallens, which means to pale grape hyacinth, and the flowers are indeed almost an ice blue. Okay, the palest of blue. Quite pretty. We actually grow that one at the botanical garden. And this is called Merindera radiana, and at one time it was considered a colchicum. Okay, so we're seeing colchicums flowering now. That's the autumn crocus. And there's a number of them now peaking at the botanical garden. But this is essentially a spring blooming colchicum, which is now put into its own genus, called Merendera. And here's a closer view of those primroses, the Primula algida. Very, very prolific. And down at the bottom of the screen, these little succulent rosettes you see here, that's Sedum spurium. That's the dragon's blood sedum. Okay, a very, very common plant for a lot of us grow. And that particular plant is actually native and wild in Georgia. This is another primrose. It's called Primula auriculata, and it always grew again, on these sort of melting streams right on the edges of the snow. So it really wants super duper wet soil conditions, at least while it's in bloom. I suspect during the summer, it probably gets a heck of a lot drier there. Gentians, nothing that looks more gorgeous in the mountains than seeing the gentians, because that color blue is just so intense. So this is Gentiana verna, subspecies angulosa. It's one I've tried to grow in my own garden. I've never had any success with it, but I do know people who can grow it. Another little gentian, this is Gentiana pyrenaica, which is interesting because pyrenaica I saw in the Pyrenees. Okay, so it's just one of these really weird little gentians that even though it occurs in the Pyrenees, it also occurs in the Alps and in the Caucasus. Yeah, closer view of the flower, quite beautiful. And yet another little gentian, this is called Gentiana aquatica. Now, what you don't realize is just how tiny those flowers are. That's quite the macro photo I have there. Those individual flowers are probably only about half the size to a third the size of your pinky fingernail. Okay, so very, very tiny. And it was only because I was down taking pictures of the other gentian that I stumbled into the little itty bitty flowers of this particular gentian. I was quite amazed. Beautiful color blue. This is, again, very, very pale blue, but a very, very tiny, probably the smallest flowered gentian I've ever seen. This is a globe flower, Trollius patulus. So again, something like a marsh marigold, but we grow, of course, in our gardens, we grow globe flower. Okay, so this is one of the, basically a dwarf globe flower, but closely related to the marsh marigolds. A closer view of the flower there. Astragalus. So they have a lot of different astragalus species. A number of the ones I saw, I could never identify. This one right here, I could identify because it's Astragalus fragrans, which suggests that it's fragrant, and indeed it was. Most astragalus don't have much of a fragrance, so it does help with the ID of this particular plant. Okay, so now we're going to go into the alpine meadows. All right, so we're getting a little bit lower in elevation, but you can see in this picture here, lots of yellow flowers in the foreground there. Most of the evergreens that are here are actually Juniperus communis, the common juniper. So it's basically the same as what we see growing up on top of the Hawk Hills. So here we have Star of Bethlehem, Ornithogalum schmelhausenii. So it's different species than the common Star of Bethlehem that we grow, but otherwise it looks very, very similar. So it's a little bulbous plant. This is a Daphne, Daphne glomerata, super duper fragrant. Typical of all Daphnes. Now we're used to Daphnes being pink in color, but the one that this particular species is sort of a creamy white. Viola, Sienna. Very nice little viola. It looks a lot like a Dunca. And all that yellow you saw was Potentilla cransii. So that one should look familiar to any of you who have been up on the Northern Peninsula. So it's another one of these species that occurs in Eastern North America, but also occurs on isolated mountaintops throughout Europe and throughout Asia as well. So it's got a whole Arctic distribution. So it's nice to see one of these, a plant that I was so familiar with. Anemone fasciculata, absolutely gorgeous plant. I grew this from seed. I have it growing in my own garden. It's a beautiful garden plant, very long-lived. It sort of reminds you of one of these bunch-flowered narcissus. And in fact, there is an anemone narcissiflora, very, very closely related to this. So white with just a little bit of pink on the reverse of the petals. Androsaceae villosa, very, very popular rock garden plant. A number of our members from the Rock Garden Society are tried and grown this one. And Arnemia pulchra. So this is another boraginaceae. What's interesting, when the flowers first open, they're just plain yellow. And then as they age, they develop these brown spots. And I guess it must be a way, you can sort of see that initially those brown spots are more white, and then they develop into brown. And so I'm assuming there's got to be a way to let the pollinator either know I'm now producing pollen, or I'm now producing nectar, or I've already been visited, go away. One or the other, those are your choices. Erysimum ibericum. So this is a wallflower. A little mustard, remember the mustard family. Minuartia imbricata. So we have a number of minuartias. If you go to the tablelands, you got Minuartia marcescens. So this one looks somewhat similar to that. Closer view. Certainly when you look at the flowers close up, you can certainly see that it's definitely one of the little chickweed relatives. Little sandwort. Ajuga orientalis. Now, a number of us grow ajuga. That's the bugleweed. It's a bit of it lives up to its name. It's a little bit weedy at times, but it's still a very popular garden plant. Ajuga orientalis, what's interesting on this particular plant is when it starts produces flower stems, and you get these very, very hairy, dark purple leaves that grow up on this little pyramidal stalk. And then the little blue flowers just sort of poke out from between all this purple, hairy bracts, essentially. So it's quite an interesting little plant. I wouldn't mind growing that one in my garden if I could find it. Okay, this is Pulsatilla violacea. So it's one of the pasque flowers. And all the pasque flowers, for the most part, are mostly native to Europe, and a few that make it into Asia. So Pulsatilla violacea, we grow that at the Botanical Garden. And the flowers are typically purple, but you can also get white and yellow versions of this as well. Probably one of the showier plants I saw when I was up there in the mountains. It's quite spectacular. Polygala alpicola. So it's called a milkwort. Again, very, very tiny. That leaf you see in the center that my mouse is around, that's the leaf of a clover. Okay, so it's just a typical clover leaf. So that'll give you an appreciation for just how small the individual flowers are on this particular plant. And they can vary from being sort of a paler lilac-y blue to being a fairly deep, almost an indigo type color. And again, you can see a clover leaf. And they're just growing in the lawns. This was the only iris that we saw over there, Iris furcata. And it's just sort of a little bit past its peak. I managed to find one flower. It's interesting, we're driving along on a major highway, and I actually saw this flash of purple as we're driving by, and I said, stop the car, there's something impressive back here. And so we had to haul over to the side of the road. We all peeled out of the little minibus and walked back the road, and this is what we ended up seeing. So it was nice that we were able to stop to see it. Pedicularis is one of the louseworts. So this is a hemiparasitic plant, much like our rattle, yellow rattle. So Pedicularis acmodonta. Now, so in other areas where we went to, this looked fairly dry, and it was relatively dry while we're there. And so while we're sort of wandering around all these rocky crags and crevices, we were looking for little plants that were growing in amongst those. Now, I have to say this particular area here is limestone. Most of the other areas that I've been showing you previous to this were mostly granitic, so more acid type soil. But this particular area here, it's all very weathered limestone. So somewhat reminiscent of the Northern Peninsula and the limestone barrens in that regards, but far more rugged than what our limestone barrens would be. And it was just interesting the way the geology of the rocks were here and the way they weathered. So what were some of the things we saw there? Well, one of the most common plants we saw were the hens and chicks. So this is Sempervivum caucasicum with these little sort of thumbnail size little succulent rosettes. And this is Sempervivum transcaucasicum, very similar to the hens and chicks that we grow in our own gardens. So it's sort of neat to see these actually growing in the wild. And this is Sempervivum armenum. And those little leaves you see growing around it is a lady's mantle, an alchemilla. Saxifraga juniperifolia. So this particular saxifrage had really spiny, spiky, pointy leaves and a very, very hard dome. So it's not a plant you want to sit on it, but yet it's hard enough that you could sit on it, but it wouldn't be particularly, it'd be like sitting on a bed of nails. It's amazing. And in places they grew just under vertical rocks. It's amazing how the seeds can take root. And there's a closer view of the flowers. So the flowers themselves are not necessarily that showy, but you sort of get an appreciation of just how pointed the leaves are. This is a little draba bryoides. That one had very soft little rosettes, but again, very hard, or very compact, we'll say, little rosettes. And you can see in this particular picture right here, that's a little saxifrage. Okay, a little Saxifraga paniculata growing next to it. Over on the other side, you can see one of the little hens and chicks growing next to it. And then the plant you see in the background here is more of the sedum spurium, the dragon's blood sedums. So speaking of that saxifrage, so they have Saxifraga paniculata. It's got a worldwide, I should say, a whole Arctic distribution across the Northern Hemisphere. But their particular variety over there is a subspecies called cartilaginea. So the leaves are actually a little more pointed than our native ones. Here you can go, you can see a closer view of the flower or the leaves. So ours would have a little bit more rounded leaf. The cartilaginea, has much more pointed leaves. One of the few ferns I saw growing there, this is Woodsia alpina, just growing out of the cracks in the rock. So one of the areas that we did a bit of a hike up through was the Trousseau River Valley. We couldn't go right to the end of it because we'd be entering into Russia. And there was actually a guard house at the end of this particular valley to prevent people from accidentally walking into Russia. So some of the plants we saw as we were hiking up that valley is another Viola samchetka, Viola rickenbackiana, closer view. A draba, which I could never figure out what species it was. A closer view of the flower. It's a pretty little thing, but our guide wasn't familiar with it. Veronica lewanensis. So it's a little speedwell. Veronica filiformis. Very, very pale blue flowers. But the markings, those on the, I guess it's the lower lip or the upper lip, depending on what way you want to look at it. Looks like little blue eyelashes. Another viola, or primula, sorry, this is Primula darialica. So a lot of the primroses are very similar. They're basically only differ in their size. Essentially, they all have these sort of typical lilac-y pink flowers. Another astragalus, couldn't tell you what species. Obviously, it's growing right next to a hens and chick there. We visited the town of Snow. Now, town of Snow lives up to its name, I'm sure, for several months of the year. It is buried in snow, but it's at the base of one of the mountain ranges in the Greater Caucasus. And it's like stepping back in time because all the homes that are there are made of rock. They're just stone houses. So this is a little monastery that was there. Obviously, that's not made of stone. It is concrete, but that's probably a little bit more modern, we'll say, than the rest of the town. Most of the town, this is what you're seeing. I mean, so this is the way the homes would have been like back in the 12th and 13th century. So you really were sort of stepping back in time, other than the fact they had glass windows. But all the houses were basically, the walls and the roofs were just made of slate, just a local stone. So the houses were stone, the walls were stone. It was quite amazing. Now, obviously, the roofs here are terracotta in this regards, but still, it was a very poor community. And like I said, it looked like it was an abandoned community, but people were actually living in these homes. So it was quite interesting to wander around this particular town. Botanically speaking, there wasn't much there to speak of. So the reason we went to Snow is because we wanted to go up to this valley here and investigate what was growing along the edges of the forest here. This is part of our group. I think there were 14 of us in total, but at this particular time, the other half were off wandering through the woods, and there were a few people here. And I said, boys, let me get a picture of you. Because if I don't take a picture of you now, I'm not going to get any pictures. So in fact, in the center here, this man, woman, they were our local guides. Our actual guide from England, he was off wandering away in the woods somewhere. So, but these two young people, they were the local guides. And she was doing her, I think it was her master's in botany, as it turned out, at the University of Tbilisi. So wandering around the edge of the forest here, we saw another fritillaria. This is Fritillaria colina, beautiful yellow flowers with these beautiful intricate brown markings. Another primrose, Primula amoena, a bit deeper purple than the previous primroses that we're seeing. And we actually found a white one as well, which was quite special. Primula cordifolia, very, very pale yellow. And called cordifolia because the leaves are shaped like hearts. Primula macrocalyx. So it's a very close relative to the cowslip primrose that we grow in our gardens around here. And that plant you see here growing all around the edge, that's stinging nettle. So there are certain plants that thankfully you can recognize before you touch it. This is a little corydalus or corydalis, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Corydalus Emmanuelii var pallidiflora. So the name is actually a heck of a lot bigger than what the plant is. The plant itself is actually pretty small. We did find another orchid here, a dactylorhiza. Oops, I said dactylorixa. This was a dactylorhiza, Eusina. So something like our Mayalis. It's got the purple spots on the leaves. And another dactylorhiza, Sambucina subspecies flavescens. Oxalis acetosella, so that's one of the shamrocks. And then we walked up to this valley. It was quite the hike. You can see our group there. It was a fairly hot day. I think I was the only person that was wearing shorts. I wore shorts even up in the mountains. But I found it was starting to get pretty warm there. And this is getting lower down now. So you can see the trees are quite well leafed out. And it was probably about a 3 or 4 kilometer hike one way up through this valley just to find a particular plant called Paris incompleta. So it's the incomplete Paris. And I'm not talking about the city. So strangely enough, this is the plant. And it's actually a trillium relative. Okay, so the leaves are very much like a trillium. But whereas we're used to seeing trilliums, if you're in Ontario, of course, the petals are white or red, depending on the species. In this case here, it's like a green flowered trillium. Okay, so otherwise, the flowers are very similar to, if that was white in color, you'd say, yeah, that's a trillium. But because it's green, it looks quite different. So over in Europe, there are no trilliums. And the genus that replaces them over there is called Paris. So this is Paris incompleta. I'm not sure what's incomplete about it, but I didn't name it. But we did see it anyway. Like I said, it was a bit of a hike to find it, but it's a very special plant. Okay, so we left from the Greater Caucasus. We went across the low-lying areas through all the pasture lands. At that point, it was basically lots of yellow fields of canola, not much to take pictures of, really. And we headed on over then to the Lesser Caucasus. So now we're sort of on the southern end of the country. And this is the Javakheti Mountains. You can still see lots of snow. But if you look up here where you follow my mouse, this line you see here, and the line goes back up, and then that line goes right back up to the top. That's the highway. So we actually got right to the very top of the mountains here. So it's fantastic when you can drive to the tops of the mountains and not have to hike up there. But you can see the trees are just starting to leaf here. So we're going back in time compared to the valleys down below. So here I am now up close to the very top of the mountain, looking across throughout the rest of the Lesser Caucasus. And you can see the trees here in the foreground are barely showing any leaves at all. In fact, there's still a couple of little patches of snow here. Okay, trees here are not leafed out at all. These are all beech trees, European beech, by the way. And you can see right up here on the top, this is a military outpost. And that's where the road basically brought you to. And then the guards had to come out and they had to check your passport, and you weren't allowed to take any pictures again, because apparently there's some big oil field or oil pipeline that goes through this particular area. So they're all very hush-hush over what goes on there. So we were warned, don't take any pictures, don't take out your camera while we're in this area. So we were there probably about 45 minutes before they checked through all our credentials and let us go on our way. So we were up in the plateau now, so you can sort of see off in the background here. I get my mouse. Here you go. So this was part of that area where we had to check in, and then we could follow along on a gravel road across the top of the mountain. So still lots of snowbanks around, but what we're looking at here is this little sea of blue, these ribbons of blue. There's our ribbons of blue. That's all scillas. Okay, squills, a little bulb, a little spring bulb, quite spectacular. And they grew by the millions. I mean, the whole mountaintops. Now, what you're seeing here, all these little sticks sticking up here, that's all Iramuris, which is a lily relative, and that's the old flower stalks of the lily. So the lily hadn't shown itself at all at this time of the year. So it was only the scillas. Once the scillas have finished doing their thing, then these foxtail lilies will start to poke up. And then in late summer is when the foxtail lilies would produce all these spikes, generally a sort of yellowy orange flowers. So all we're seeing here in the spring of the year is just the remnants of the old flower stalks. So here are all these beautiful scillas, and it was break your heart to try to walk, because I kept walking, trying to step in between them. So I didn't want to step on them. So here's a closer view. I actually grow this one in my garden. So it's perfectly hardy for our climate. Most of them have this really ice blue. Seems like a lot of the blues in Georgia are very pale blue. But some of them were a little bit deeper. So there's a little bit of variation amongst. We even saw some white ones as well. And this was a white one with just the blue tips. What's interesting is that the anthers are blue. Okay, most plants have yellow anthers, but these ones here have these blue anthers, which are quite striking. And here's a pure white one. So growing in amongst all those scillas was another primrose. This is Primula elatior subspecies ruprechtii. So this is basically an oxlip. Okay, it's the Caucasian version of an oxlip primrose. There's a nice robust specimen of that. Another draba, which we couldn't figure out what it was. And off to this side right here, this is actually Stachys. Trying to remember the common name on Stachys now. lamb's ear. Okay, so that's one of their native species of lamb's ear. So it was a very pretty, again, very nice looking draba, but have no idea what species it is. This is called Coronilla parviflora. It's a little pea relative. Something like a small version of a bird's foot trefoil. Arabis. Okay, so we're used to seeing Arabis alpina when we go up into the limestone barrens. Their equivalent over there is Arabis brachycarpa. Another pulsatilla. This is Pulsatilla georgica, after Georgia. Very, very pale, almost a gray lavender type color. Again, all these little succulent leaves coming up here, that's more sedum spurium, the dragon's blood sedums, which are very, very common. A little daisy relative, Anthemis zygia. Now we're going to move to another mountain range. This is the Borjomi Mountains, next to the town of Zakari. Now, what you don't realize here is I was standing on a ridge and we end up hiking to this ridge. We had to hike right across here, this area. And it looks like it's really easy and it's really steep. So, I mean, there was no trees and nothing like that in your way, but it was quite a grueling hike by the time we got to the very top of that hill. So here I am at the bottom and I had to hike right to the top up there. It was, the view up there was spectacular, I have to admit. It was well worth the investment in time. So here's the view from the top of that. And again, it's all limestone in this particular area. So now I'm looking across the Lesser Caucasus, and off in the distance, you can see more of the snow-capped mountains. So we came up here for a particular reason. Here's another view from up on the top of that ridge. There's actually a little tower with an elevation marker there. So this yellow you see in the foreground here, that's another little draba that's growing there. And this was the most spectacular place, I suppose, for diversity of all the places we went to. So this was just like sort of hiking up over that hillside. There was this yellow draba. There was that fritillaria, okay, the checkered lily. And these are just regular, everyday grape hyacinths, the same grape hyacinths we grow in our gardens here, which is Muscari armeniacum. And they were just all growing wild. In this case here, it was the Muscari. They were growing here with the ornithogalums, the Star of Bethlehem. And here's that draba growing with more fritillarias. So again, it was really hard to sort of take a step here without stepping on plants. And so again, it sort of break your heart to do that. And talk about grape hyacinths with this particular draba again. So there's a closer view there of the common grape hyacinth. Again, when you have that much diversity and that many numbers, you're bound to find an alba form now and then. So here's more of that Fritillaria latifolia. Very prolific. And those bells were like, oh my gosh, 3 or 4 inches across. I mean, it's amazing the size of them for the size of the plant. Here's another Star of Bethlehem. This is Ornithogalum woronoii. A closer view there. And I showed you before the Primula auriculata. I said it oftentimes grew at the edges of the melting snow. So on this particular hillside was this river of purple. And I was thinking, oh, well, it might not be very wet here. But once you got over, there was actually a little stream that was flowing through there. So that's where they were all growing. It was just in this little tiny little ravine, which was quite wet and mucky. But it looks something like our drumstick primrose, I guess. It's probably the closest common plant I can think of that you might recognize. So there you go. So it does look something like a drumstick primrose. And a closer view. It was quite a spectacular place for diversity. That one there just really struck me. It was just a perfect ball. More of the anemone caucasica, this one here being a very pale blue. The ones we saw in the greater Caucasus were much deeper blue. You can even see on the top here a white one. There you go. And again, more of the gentians. Once you got to the very top of that ridge, you see these little spots, and you can see right down over the hillside here by the mouse here, these little blue dots. And that's more of that gentian. It's quite spectacular and really shows up quite dramatically. Another Corydalus angustifolia. Scilla siberica. So yet another plant that's really common, a very common bulb that we grow in our gardens. And again, it was so interesting to see these actually growing in the wild. And in the wild, they're just basically growing naturalized in lawn type areas in these meadows. And they basically do the same thing in my own backyard. Euphorbia mercenites. So that's the plant you see here at the bottom. It's a little spurge. And this is a little fleabane, one of the little erigerons. This is a very bizarre plant. This is another pedicularis, another one of the louseworts. Pedicularis wilhelmsiana. And again, very hairy inside. You get these purple bracts, modified leaves poking out of the hair. And then the flowers just sort of poke out from that hair and just barely make their presence known. So they're quite well hidden in amongst the flower spike. This is a Centaurea, which is one of the cornflowers, Centaurea bella. Really beautiful silvery foliage. And there's the flowers there, including a painted lady butterfly. So related to the knapweeds, which are so common around here. Scrophularia chrysantha. So this is one of the figworts. Now our figworts have really non-showy flowers, just sort of a greeny brown, a rather rank looking weedy type plant. But these ones over there were actually quite pretty. Scrophularia chrysantha. Chrysantha meaning yellow or gold. Now, the main reason that we went to this particular mountain was because there are two species of rhododendron native in the Caucasus. One is rhododendron luteum, which is an azalea. We did see some of those, but they weren't in flower. We just saw them. They didn't even have leaves, just tight bud. And then rhododendron caucasicum. So this one looks more like a regular rhododendron that we grow in our gardens, but the plants themselves probably only grow about 4 feet tall. You can see lots of very tight buds, but way down from the top of that valley, way down the next valley, the bottom, I could see a couple of blossoms. And I figured I'm never going to be here again. This is the second last day of the trip. I really wanted to get a picture of the caucasicum. So I sort of broke away from the group and went on down into this valley. And I told him, I said, you know, hopefully I'll catch up with you back at the bus. You won't be waiting for me too long. So I did have to rush, and at that elevation, it was a bit taxing to say the least. But this is what the flowers are like. Not particularly showy, I suppose, but still, it's just interesting to see the flowers on this rhododendron, which are really sort of almost an ivory type color. So that was sort of one of the highlights of the trip, if you're a rhododendron lover like I am. Okay, and with that, I bring you to the end of the wonderful trip to Georgia. So what I'm going to do now is close that out. There you go. And I'm not sharing anymore. All right, so you can now unmute if you have any questions. I'll follow it up that this particular Green Tours company, they also do a trip to Georgia in June, which basically I need to do just to get a complete look at all the flowers they have to offer. Because we saw lots of geraniums, we saw delphiniums, we saw peonies, but none of them were in bloom, of course, at this time. They were just starting to poke up. Presumably, they're all supposed to bloom in the latter part of June when they do their second tour of this particular area. So, excuse me, that's on the bucket list. Once the COVID's all over with and the world gets back to normal, hopefully at some point in the future, I will try to get back there and see what the month of June has to offer in this particular country. But I was absolutely floored by the diversity of the plants that are there. So it seems like all mountain areas are always quite good for plants. But in particular, I was really pleased. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to see when I was there, but I was not disappointed in the least.
So I think, Todd, you said you would entertain a few questions. If
Yep.
anyone has questions, just unmute yourself and ask away.
Todd, I have a question.
Yep.
The plant that you showed, the latter part of the slide, just before it was over, that thing you said that it looked like it was purple flowers coming out of inside. It was like sort of woolly.
Oh yes, yeah. That's the ajuga.
Yeah, how? Not that. At the very, it was probably the
Oh,
fifth
I'm sorry.
last
I'm sorry.
slide.
Yes, the Pedicularis wilhelmsii.
Yeah, how tall
Yes.
was that?
Oh my gosh, not very. Maybe 6 inches, 5-6 inches.
Okay, looked very impressive.
It was an impressive plant, I have to admit. When I saw it, I was like, what in the heck is this? Because it looked like something more from you'd expect to see in the Himalayas, to tell you the truth. So when I looked at it close up, I could see that it was a Pedicularis. And then our tour guide told us which species it was. But it's what we call a hemiparasitic plant. So it's a very difficult plant to grow in cultivation because its roots stick onto neighboring plants and borrow and steal some nutrients from the neighboring plants. So they're not detrimental to their host plants, but they basically steal a few extra nutrients from them, but don't give anything in return. So in the garden situation, it makes it very difficult to grow.
Okay, so it'll never be grown here.
No.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay. What was the zone over there?
Pardon me?
What is their zone?
Oh,
Like, are they warmer? A little warmer?
well, in their valleys, around Tbilisi itself, they're about a zone 7, I would say.
Okay.
So they are warmer than us. But now once you're up into the mountains, they will be the same as us. I mean, where they were growing, where the scillas were growing, the pushkinias, anything up in the mountains, I would suspect they were all probably zone 4, zone 5 up in those areas. I mean, these are all the same kind of plants we're growing in our gardens here. So it would be a similar climatically to that. And when you think about it, when I got back from that trip, my scillas were flowering in my garden. So essentially they were flowering in my garden at the exact same time they were flowering in the mountains over in Georgia.
Okay. Thank you.
I was interested in the Paris because for a monocot, it was rather unusual in that it was in 4 parts instead of 3 or 6.
Yes, and yes, that's true. I think that's the other feature that separates it from the trilliums, because the trilliums are always in 3s. Paris is always in 4s, which is really weird for a monocot, as you mentioned, because they're usually in multiples of 3.
Yeah, and I should congratulate you on not sowing a single bird.
Well, to tell you the truth, it wasn't a birding trip. I was the only person there that had binoculars. I was able to identify a few of the birds I saw. Surprisingly, a lot of them are the same species you see elsewhere in Europe. So I think I only saw 3 or 4 new species up in the mountains, some specialty birds, some snowfinch and Caucasian snowcock when we're up in the mountains. But I never took a telephoto lens with me. I only just took a close-up lens.
Todd, the habitat seems very like for flower taking pictures. It seems like it wasn't a struggle to set up any flower. It wasn't easy like walking. It seems like everything looks like it's picture perfect for taking.
It wasn't the only part really that was difficult, I suppose you want to call it difficult for walking, was in some of these alpine areas, you had to slog up some pretty steep hillsides. And you don't get an appreciation, you know, some of these hills, they look like they're nicely grassed, looks like just nicely, gently sloping meadows, but some of them are pretty grueling, you know, and places you're almost on your hands and knees crawling up some of these hillsides. So it wasn't, not everybody did that. I did it just because I really wanted to see some of the special plants that were growing there. But even the people that were on the trip that just sort of stuck to the trails, which were very easy walking, they still saw almost as many flowers as I did. I might have, you know, it might have been an extra dozen plants I got to see just because I took that little bit of an extra effort.
Yeah.
But overall, it was a very, very easy trip.
You know, I know you see a lot of green hills and stuff, but you know that the pictures of the house where you showed the house and then behind is this muddy mountain that looks gray brown. Do you see anything when you're on those sort of mountains? Is there vegetation or flowering things? It looks very gray and it goes on forever. Is there anything on those?
I was suspected that was gray and going on forever just because the snow had probably just melted. I'd suspect that if you get up close and personal, there probably are a few things starting to flower there. But as the season progresses, I suspect those gray hills will end up turning green. But I think it's just that the snow had just really melted just within, really, I suppose, within days of taking the photo.
The pictures are gorgeous. Even the hens and chicks. My God, those pictures are gorgeous. Really nice.
It was so great to see so many of these plants that I'm, like I said, that I'm growing in my own garden, and give you appreciation then of how to try to grow them in your own garden. And in particular, of course, mostly what we're looking at were alpine flowers. So because I'm sort of more interested in rock garden plants than anything else, it was really, you know, it was very educational, we'll say, to see exactly the way these plants grow in the wild. And basically, we need to duplicate the same scenario in our own gardens in order to be successful in growing them.
Todd?
Thanks.
Yeah, since Howard brought up animals, if you feel a little homesick for the Caucasus Mountains in Georgia, you should know that there's a little slug called the worm slug. It's called boat gorilla pallens, since you're into the names. Now, it's interesting because it's native to the Caucasus Mountains, and it's only spread beyond the Caucasus Mountains in the last 50 or 100 years. Before 50 or 100 years ago, it was completely just restricted to the Caucasus Mountains. So anyway, the point is, in St. John's, in Kelly's Brook Valley, down below Empire Avenue, it exists there in a little wood. So if you ever feel homesick, I'll take you and try and show you some. Formerly restricted to the Caucasus Mountains entirely.
Oh my
How
God.
did it get there, he said.
That's a good question.
Anyway, that's it.
The mystery. I can't say that I noticed any slugs when I was over there, but I wasn't really looking.
No, these are little tiny things. They live underground. You don't see them very often.
Oh, okay.
Which is why I probably never saw them before.
Right on.
Caucasus Mountains.
Todd, you didn't seem, so I was just going to say, you didn't seem to have much wind, you know, so often.
We were very
wind
fortunate
blowing?
because when you think about it, a lot of times when you're in the mountains, it can be quite windy. I think there was only, I don't know if it was any day, thinking back on it, I don't think we had any days that was particularly windy, nothing like what we have around here. So again, as a result, taking pictures of the flowers was really easy because a lot of these flowers were quite tiny or on little delicate stalks, which of course around here, you'd probably never get, you know, steady enough to be able to get a sensible picture. But there was no issues over there at all. And I guess it's probably because it's such a centrally located country. As you get into sort of the middle of continents, generally is much calmer than what it is out towards the, we'll say the perimeters, closer to the ocean, we'll say. So like I said, it was easy walking. That time of the year, the temperatures were very, very comfortable. It was only that hike up looking for the Paris that I thought was a bit warm. Most of the people on the tour thought it was great. The temperature was probably only 21 or 22 degrees, but once it hits 20 degrees, I start to melt. So, so for me, I found it a little bit warm, but for the rest of the participants, they thought it was wonderful. In fact, I suspect on the mountains, they thought it was cold. They probably thought I was crazy being up in the mountains in shorts, but I don't find my legs get cold. It's only my upper body. So, I mean, I still wore a fleece, but there's no problem hiking around in the mountains with shorts on.
Todd, lots of nice vegetable gardens in the rural.
Almost every rural, a rural town that we went through, everybody had their own little vegetable plots. And once you got down into sort of the low-lying areas around Tbilisi, and between the two mountain ranges, there were lots of orchards. I mean, there was lots of apple orchards, plums, pears, sort of along those lines. It really is, I suppose, a little bit of a breadbasket area for that part of Europe or Asia, depending on what you consider it to be.
Of course, they grow wine there too.
Pardon me?
They have wine. They grow grapes for wine. There's Georgian
Yes.
wine.
Oh, yes. And we had some of their wines, some of the grapes, while we were there. And I have to say, I wasn't keen on their wine. I'm a bit of a snob in that regards. So it was mostly red wine that we were being served when we're having our meals in the different little hotels we stayed at. Now, maybe they weren't giving us their high-end stuff. They were probably just giving us the dregs, who's to say, but it was wet, it was red, so we drank it.
Reminds me of the time we were in Prague and we got some $2 Czech wine in the supermarket, and it tasted just like you'd expect $2 Czech wine to taste.
Yeah, it was pretty much the same idea.
So, any more questions? I guess if not, we certainly thank you, Todd. Yeah, Carmen, you're going to thank
Thanks,
Priscilla. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
All the photos are gorgeous.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Todd.
Super.
Well, you're very
Yeah, thank
welcome.
you.
And I'm glad that hopefully this will be like I said, we've opened up the floodgates for
Yes.
future Zoom meetings now, right? This went off swimmingly, so I see no
Yes.
reason why, all the rest of your future speakers now won't go along just as well.
And I mean, for a first crack at something like this, we had 25 people. So, I mean, sometimes we don't have more than that in the
regular
room,
meeting.
although the difference here is that we've got some people from away.
Yes, and
Wonderful.
that's a great part of it. Like I said,
That's right.
these people never have an opportunity to come to our meetings. So, the Zoom does have its advantages.
Yeah, Lois and Charles, and I don't know who else, but anyway.
Anne and Michael
And then Michael,
Yeah.
of course, yes. So that's good.
and Lois.
And Lois, yeah. Yeah, I think Anne has gone to sleep in the background there.
Thanks,
Anyway,
Todd.
Well, yeah,
This
thank
is
you.
where we present you with the bottle of wine. So
Yeah.
That's right.
It's coming.
Sorry,
It'll be a bit better than a $2 bottle of wine.
I was going to say, we'll have to drink a virtual glass of wine.
she'll email it to you anytime.
Yes.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks,
Anyway,
everyone.
very
Thanks.
enjoyable.
Yeah, thank
Have a good
you.
evening.
Good night.
And we'll see you
Yeah.
next.
Everybody. See you
Okay.
next month.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right.
So long, leaving.
Yes, leaving.